Hello, my tiny loves. We are going to read from the Borrowers again. Getting so close to the end. Look at that. Today we are starting on chapter 17, and let me see what just happened on chapter 16. Mrs. Driver had just noticed all the things missing, and then she thinks something's up. So she was like, she can play at that game. She's gonna do something to catch whoever's taking all the stuff. All right, chapter 17. Mrs. Driver was short with Camphor that evening. She would not sit down and drink with him as usual, but stumped around the kitchen, looking at him sideways every now and again out of the corner of her eyes. He seemed uneasy, as indeed he was. There was a kind of menace in her silence, a hidden something which no one could ignore. Even Aunt Sophie felt it when Mrs. Driver brought up her wine. She heard the clink of the decanter against the glass as Mrs. Driver set down the tray. And in the rattle of the wooden rings as Mrs. Driver drew the curtains. It was in the tremble of the floorboards as Mrs. Driver crossed the room, and in the click of a latch as Mrs. Driver closed the door. "What's the matter with her now?" Aunt Sophie wondered vaguely as delicately ungreedily she poured the first glass. The boy had felt it too. From the way Mrs. Driver had stared at him as he sat hunched in the bath, from the way she soaped the sponge and the way she said, "And now." She had scrubbed him slowly with careful, angry steadiness, and all through the bathing time she did not say a word. When he was in bed, she had gone through all of his things, peering into cupboards and opening his drawers. She had pulled his suitcase out from under the wardrobe and found his dear dead mole and his hoard of sugar lumps and her best potato knife. But even then, she had not spoken. She had thrown the mole in the wastepaper basket, made some angry noises with her tongue, and she pocketed the potato knife and all the sugar lumps. She had stared at him a moment before she turned the gas low, a strange stare at bed, more puzzled than accusing. Mrs. Driver slept above the scullery. She had her own back stairs. That night she did not undress. She set the alarm clock for midnight and put it where the tick would not disturb her outside her door. She unbuttoned her tight shoes and crawled, grunting a little, under the eiderdown. Eiderdown must be something on a bed, but I don't know what it means. Eiderdown, right? Because she grunted a little crawled under the eiderdown. Anyways, sorry, back to business. She had barely closed her eyes, as she told Crampfurl afterwards, when the clock shrilled off, chattering and rattling on its four legs on the bare boards of the passageway. Mrs. Driver tumbled herself out of bed and fumbled her way to the door. "Shush," she said to the clock as she felt for the catch. "Shush," and clasped it to her bosom. She stood there in her stockinged feet at the head of the scullery stairs. Something, it seemed, had flickered below, a hint of light. Mrs. Driver peered down the dark curve of the narrow stairway. Yes, there it was again, a moth-wing flutter. Candlelight. That's what it was. A moving candle beyond the stairs, beyond the scullery, somewhere within the kitchen. Clock in hand, Mrs. Driver creaked down the stairs in her stockinged feet, panting a little in her eagerness. There seemed a sigh in the darkness, an echo of movement, and it seemed to Miss Driver, standing there on the cold stone flags of the scullery, that this sound, that was barely a sound, could only mean one thing. The soft swing to of the green baize door, that door that led out of the kitchen and into the main hall beyond. Hurriedly, Mrs. Driver felt her way into the kitchen and fumbled for matches along the ledge above the stove. She knocked off a pepper pot and a paper bag of cloves, and glancing quickly downward, saw a filament of light. She saw it in the second before she struck a match, a thin thread of light, it looked like, on the floor beside her feet. It ran in an oblong shape, outlining a rough square. Mrs. Driver gasped and lit the gas, and the room leapt up around her. She glanced quickly at the baize door. There seemed to her startled eye a quiver of movement in it, as though it had just swung to. She ran to it and pushed it open. but the passage beyond was still and dark, no flicker of shadow nor sound in the distant footfall. She let the door fall again and watched it as it swung back slowly, regretfully, held by its heavy spring. Yes, that was the sound she had heard from the scullery, that sighing whisper like an indrawn breath. Cautiously, clutching back her skirts, Mrs. Driver moved toward the stove. An object lay there, something pinkish, on the floor beside the jutting board. Ah, she realized, that board. That was where the light was from. She hesitated and glanced around the kitchen. Everything else looked normal, and just as she had left it, the plates on the dresser, the saucepans on the wall, and the row of tea towels hanging symmetrically on their strings above the stove. The pinkish object she saw now was a heart-shaped cachou box. C-A-C-H-O-U. One that she knew well from the glassed-in tray table beside the fireplace in the drawing room. She picked it up. It was enamel and gold and set with tiny brilliants. "Well, she began, and stooping swiftly, with a sudden angry movement, she wrenched back a piece of the floor. And then she shrieked, loud and long. She saw movement, a running, scrambling, fluttering, and she heard a squeaking, a jabbering, and gasping. Little people, they looked like, with hands and feet and mouths opening. That's what they looked like. But they couldn't be that, of course, running here and there and everywhere. "Oh, oh!" she shrieked and felt behind her for a chair. She clambered onto it, and it wobbled beneath her, and she climbed, still shrieking, from the chair to the table. And there she stood, marooned, crying and gasping and calling out for help, until, after hours it seemed, there was a rattling at the scullery door. Crampfurl it was, roused at last by the light and the noise. "What is it? Let me in," he called, but Mrs. Driver could not leave the table. "Honest! Honest!" she shouted. "Alive and squeaking!" Crampfurl threw his weight against the door and burst open the lock. He staggered, suddenly dazed, into the kitchen, his corduroy trousers pulled on over his nightshirt. "Where?" he cried, his eyes wide beneath his tousled hair. "What sort of nest?" Mrs. Driver, sobbing still with fright, pointed at the floor. Crampfurl walked over in a slow, deliberate way and stared down. He saw a hole in the floor, lined with and cluttered with small objects. Children's toys, they looked like, bits of rubbish, and that was all. "It's nothing," he said after a moment. "It's that boy, that's what it is." He stirred the contents with his foot, and the partitions fell down. "There ain't nothing alive in there." "But I saw them, I tell you," gasped Mrs. Driver. "Little people, like with hands, or mice dressed up." Crampfurl stared into the hole. "Mice dressed up?" he repeated uncertainly. "Hundreds of them," went on Mrs. Driver, "running and squeaking. I saw them, I tell you." "Well, there ain't nothing there now," said Crampfurl, and he gave the final stir around with his boot. "Then they've run away," she cried. "Under the floor, up inside the walls. This place is alive with them." "Well," said Crampfurl stolidly, "maybe, but if you ask me, I think it's the boy, where he hides things." His eye brightened, and he went down on one knee. Where he's got the ferret, I shouldn't wonder." "Listen," cried Mrs. Driver. There was a despairing note in her voice. "You've got to listen. There wasn't no boy, and it wasn't no ferret." She reached for the back of the chair and lowered herself clumsily onto the floor, and she came beside him to the edge of the hole. "They had hands and faces, I tell you. Look," she said, pointing. "You see that? It's a bed. And now I come to think of it, one of 'em was in it." "Now you come to think of it," said Crampfurl. "Yes," went on Mrs. Driver firmly. "There's something else I come to think of. Remember that girl, Rosa Pickhatchet? The one that was simple? Well, simple or not, she saw one on the drawing room mantelpiece with a beard." "One what?" Mrs. Driver glared at him. "What I've been telling you about. One of these... "Mice dressed up," said Crampfurl. "Not mice," Mrs. Driver almost shouted. "Mice don't have beards." "But you said..." began Crampfurl. Yes, I know I said it. Not that these had beards, but what would you call them? What could they be but mice? Not so loud, whispered Crampfurl. You'll wake the house up. They can't hear, said Mrs. Driver. Not through the baize door. She went to the stove and picked up the fire tongs. And what if they do? We ain't done nothing. Move over, she went on. Let me get at that hole. One by one, Mrs. Driver picked things out. With many shocked gasps and cries of amazement, and did you evers, she made 2 piles on the floor, one of valuables and one of what she called rubbish. Curious objects dangled from her tongs. Would you believe it, her best lace handkerchief? And look, and here's another, and my big mattress needle, I knew I had one, my silver thimble, if you please, and one of hers. And look, oh my, at the wools, the cottons. No wonder you can never find a spool of white cotton if you want one. Potatoes, nuts, look at this, a pot of caviar. Caviar. No, it's too much, it really is. Dolls, chairs, and tables, and look at this, look at all this blotting paper. So that's where it goes. Oh, my goodness, she cried suddenly, her eyes staring. What's this? Mrs. Driver laid down the tongs and leaned into the hole, tentatively and fearfully, as though afraid of being stung. It's a watch, an emerald watch, her watch, and she never missed it. Her voice rose. And it's going. Look, you can see by the kitchen clock, 12:25. Mrs. Driver looked down suddenly at sat down suddenly on the hard chair. Her eyes were staring and her face looked white and flabby, as though deflated. You know what this means? She said to Crampfurl. No, he said. The police, said Mrs. Driver. That's what this means. A case for the police. And there's the picture. So you can see Mrs. Driver and Crampfurl. She's got the watch and her tongs. And then there's a hole in the floor with all the stuff she's pulling out. And what do you know? That's also the end of this chapter. That was a scary chapter. It's hard to think that they're going to figure out how to wrap this up in this amount of time. But they will, because it's a great book. All right, I love you. I hope you're loving it so far. I'll see you for chapter 18.